Your Summer Nights here on Radio New Zealand National, and joining us now, our singing geographer, Professor Warwick Murray, the Director of Geography Program at the Victoria University in Wellington. Not only that, he's a singer and a musician too. Good evening.
Hello, Emma. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, lovely to see you too. Thanks for coming in.
That's a pleasure. It's
not just you.
No, I've got a friend with me today, all the way from Madrid via Karori.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
This is Miguel Arnedo Gomez, otherwise known as Bongo Star, and he's a super bongo player and also an academic from Victoria, where he teaches in the Spanish program.
Right, and you've brought some congas in too.
That's right. Yeah, 2 congas and some bongos.
Lovely specimens they are. Well, shall we rip into a song? You were going to play this rather. I was going to step right back and just listen last week.
Feel free to sing along though, Emma.
If you do me the hand signals and I'll do my best.
Okay.
So it's on Globalisation?
That's right, Emma. Yeah, last week we didn't have time to fit this song in. It was called Globalisation is Not Spelt with a Z. And I wanted to use it as an example of the impacts of globalisation, the kind of thing you were talking about last week, the Walmart effect, whereby everything homogenises. And one very good example of that, a personal example, is that the book I wrote, Geographies of Globalisation, I sent it off to the publisher in 2006, fully completed, all spell checked and everything. And it came back, and all the globalisations had been changed from an S to a Z. And I wrote back to the publisher and I said, I'd like to change them back to S, please, because I live in New Zealand, I work in New Zealand, I was born in England. And they said, I'm afraid we can't, because it would damage sales in the United States. And I thought, well, that's a very good example of the kind of thing that the whole book's talking about in many ways. So in the second edition, which is coming out soon, I'm going to put this song on the inside cover.
Marvellous. And so what does the official book look like? Has it got an S or a Z in the end?
It's got a Z. That's exactly. Globalisation does not take a Z. I do wish you'd realise we must protect our S's, lest we Americanise. It's all part of their evil plan to rule everything we do. Not content with economic, political and military monopolies, they're colonizing our language too. The English language is beautiful, full of strange non-literal powers. That's why lackadaisical does not refer to a shortage of flowers. Organize is spelt with an S. Resist, decolonize your head, and join the anti-globalization movement, spelt without a Z.
Very nice touch at the end there. Thank you. So globalisation was the first of the 3 major crises you see as facing humanity currently, and the second is development.
That's right, Emma, yes. And I was hoping we might talk a little bit about that this week.
OK, what do you mean by development?
Well, development is a topic within geography, within human geography and geography more generally, that's quite new. And it's one that's become really quite vibrant and healthy within the subject. Essentially, what development geography does is it tries to, first of all, map the differences in welfare and living standards across the earth and explain why some places are poor and other places are not. Essentially, then, to understand the patterns of inequality that we see at the global scale and to try and understand what the roots of that inequality are, essentially and eventually, of course, hopefully to solve those problems. that we see. And of course, development is a massive challenge. There are at least 1.7 billion people, the United Nations Development Programme estimates, in absolute poverty as we speak, and that's well over a quarter of the world's population. So it's a serious problem, and geographers are trying to grapple with this, and they're doing so by employing their kind of tools of analysis across space and explaining those differences from place to place.
From the research that you've read, what do you see the picture as being in terms of inequality? Well,
there's absolutely no doubt that inequality across the world has become greater, but the pattern is much more complex than that. What's tended to happen is that in the middle, amongst the middle incomes, there's been a convergence whereby countries have tended to approach a higher average level of income. But at the extremes, what's quite clear is that the gap has got bigger. So countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, and some of the poorer parts of South Asia, and indeed some parts of the Pacific, like the Solomon Islands, have actually pulled further away in terms of income from the countries at the top of the scale, such as the United States and Australia and Sweden and places that tend to be in Northern Europe and Western Europe and North America. So there is, at the extreme then, a definite increase in inequality, and what geographers are trying to do is explain this.
Well, you mentioned, you mentioned 7. What's the statistic for the number of people living?
About 1.7 billion.
1.7 billion, and there's 7. Am I right? 7 billion on the planet at the moment.
That's right.
So, obviously, this has got something to do with it, right? Ever increasing populations. Yeah. What other factors are at play here? Certainly,
that's one factor that's important. Although it's important with that particular thing to be mindful of the fact that in many ways. Increased fertility and overpopulation is actually a symptom of poverty rather than the cause of it, although it does operate in a feedback mechanism. A lot of problems, development problems, do feed back in that kind of negative way. So often people will have more children simply because they're in poverty and they need those children in order to make a living. But aside from those problems of overpopulation, there's a range of problems, and geographers over the years have tried to grapple with those. And we've been through various phases. At first, geographers thought that it was something to do with the environment, and the idea was that it was determined by the environment, and that places were poor because their environments were poor. Then a little later on, with the arrival of the Cold War, it was often argued that the problem was not enough capitalism, and the modernisation theory stressed that third world countries, as they were called then, should become like Western countries and they'd be okay. There were other ideas about lack of resources, but that was blown out of the water when East Asia, which had no resources at all, began to develop very, very quickly. So what we know is that the combination of factors in any given place varies. What we do know, though, is that solutions imposed from above that don't take into account local opinions and local conditions always fail. And if there's one lesson in development geography over the last 50 years, that's it. That essentially you have to build from the bottom up, and that indeed is what geographers seek to do.
In what sort of ways are you talking here? I mean, because this is a huge problem. It seems just insurmountable. Yeah. How do you address it?
Well, it's a massive problem, absolutely. And of course, academic geographers can only go a part of the way in addressing this kind of issue. We have a lot of geographers in New Zealand who are actively involved in researching development. New Zealand's actually a very vibrant and healthy, creative development geography community.
Why is that?
I'm not quite sure. I think it's partly because we're surrounded by developing regions, so to speak. We had a big hand in the evolution of the Pacific Islands and the kind of colonial legacy there. Of course, and to our north, of course, we've got the Asia Pacific as well. So we engage deeply with those regions. And so New Zealand likes to look outwards, and I think that is reflected in the kind of geography we do. So we've got people working all across the Pacific and all across Asia. Well-known people like Tony Binns, people like Nick Lewis, people like John Overton, who's the director of the Paikakariki Institute for Social Sciences, Sarah Kindon, Andrew McGregor, all of whom are very well known in their fields, and others, of course, that I can't mention in the time we have, that are doing work on the ground, in the regions of study to try and determine what it is essentially geographically that's unique about the problems there.
Cool. So we're looking at it on a macro. Can we zoom into the micro now? What are some of the work that they're doing?
Well, for example, at Victoria at the moment we have a project on the impacts of aid in the Pacific. And recently, the way that aid's run from New Zealand, and indeed across the world, has shifted enormously. And New Zealand, in many ways, for better or for worse, has actually gone against the grain globally. And we're very interested to look at the impacts of this. And we have a large project in at Victoria that also brings in people from Massey and from the University of the South Pacific and people also all across the world. And the essential argument is that the way that aid is being ran in the Pacific at the moment actually has the impact of making Pacific Island nations less independent and less sovereign, less able to manage their own affairs, less able to determine what they want to do with that money. So we go into various island nations, we're looking at the history of aid there and how this kind of inverse sovereignty effect might work.
So what do you see as the difference in New Zealand aid to the way the rest of the world approaches aid as being?
Well, it's been reasonably controversial over the last couple of years, and essentially at the global scale, aid has been handed back, if you like, or the ownership of aid under what was the Paris Declaration of 2005. The idea there was that countries that receive the money should own what they do with it. They should own that project. They should determine their own projects and so on. The New Zealand government of late has shifted that, and it's returned to something that was more akin to what occurred in the 1980s, where infrastructure projects and projects that involve New Zealand companies and New Zealand firms have been pushed. It's a kind of more practical approach to aid than those ideas from the big global accords that occurred in the mid-2000s. Now, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but what's important is that we go out and we study it in specific localities.
Cool. So that's one example of what's going on in your department. What else is happening in terms of development studies for geographers?
Well, there's lots and lots and lots going on around the country. It's really, as I say, it's very vibrant, very healthy. We have an undergraduate development studies major at Victoria, and we've got postgraduate master's studies all across the country, at Auckland, at Massey. You can do elements of it at Otago and also at Canterbury as well as Victoria.
So what are the key elements that you study in development studies?
Well, you'd begin with looking at theory. You'd begin with looking at the history of development. Then you'd look at various issues and problems, such as urban development, rural development, political ecology. You might look at population. You might look at issues of fair trade.
You have a wee swallow of some water. I can see you're about,
you might look at issues of fair trade. And is this water fair trade?
Oh, it's rainwater.
Okay, that's fair trade. Yeah, that's fair enough. And then beyond that, you'd then look at those issues in the context of specific places. And that's what you were studying. And our master's students are a really amazing bunch, and we've got such a fascinating and interesting bunch of young people who are doing some wonderful stuff. Things on NGOs in Fiji, things on Fiji water, things on the impacts of development in New Caledonia, tourism in Samoa, and so on and so forth. Very, very interesting things. I've got one PhD student at the moment, Colin Kennedy, who's doing a fascinating study on inequality in Chile. Chile is an amazingly interesting place. It's the place I've done most of my work. It's grown so rapidly over the last 30 years economically, and some people would say, well, that means it's developed. In fact, it's just joined the OECD. However, it's become more and more unequal as a society, and to me, that's the opposite of development.
Well, development is a pretty contentious term, really, isn't it?
It is.
Developing into what?
Exactly. That's right, Emma. And the thing is, what geography also does is it looks at the different concepts of development in different places. It doesn't just map it as an objective entity. It looks at how different cultures and different societies actually look at and construct development themselves. And we argue that it's very important that those notions are taken into account. Indeed, everything should be built from that. And yes, the concepts vary enormously. So measuring it in the first place is very, very difficult and contentious.
I imagine you have a song around this topic, do you?
Oh, yeah, I do actually. Surprise, surprise. I've got a song about some work that I did in Chile. I did my PhD on these issues in Chile, as I briefly mentioned previously.
What was your PhD about, sorry?
Oh, it was on the impacts of free market economics, neoliberalism, globalisation on peasant farmers in the Andes. And so what tended to happen is that fruit companies that came in to facilitate the export of wonderful fruits from Chile, ended up buying the land that had been received by those growers in land reforms some 20 years prior to that. And in some ways, this was the unravelling of development, and it led to all sorts of inequalities in the countryside and had deep psychological, social and political impacts.
So taking that one step back, did they need to sell the farms because they couldn't compete with the big fruit companies?
Yeah,
right.
It was partly that, and it was also because there was a certain amount of hoodwinking that went on amongst the firms.
Hoodwinking?
Yeah, well, the small growers were it was made obligatory that they put their farms up and they mortgaged their farms against what the companies call bad debt, and many growers ended up with bad debt and they had to lose their farms because of it. Really, it's an early example of what people are now calling land grabs.
Right, well, let's hear it.
Okay.
Oh, Miguel's back, by the way.
Great.
Nice to have you.
Thank you.
So this song's called Must a Man Sell His God? In this land of the labouring hand, you cannot separate a man from his land. Born in the dust, to die in the dust. The land is his Lord, and in the Lord he places trust. Now in the dust is planted gold, and green vines grow in the desert of old. Green teems down the once empty riverbeds, floods people's homes and floods people's heads. Must a man sell his God? Must a man sell his God? Flooding the villages one by one, to their houses, their homes, their history's gone. Still the people learn more day by day. This luscious green river flows only one way. Still the people dutifully gather their crop from vines that weep in pearly teardrops, with head and heart constantly at odds. To feed his own mouth must a man sell his God. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Warwick Murray and Miguel. What's your last name, Miguel?
My last name is Arnedo Gomez.
Miguel Arnedo Gomez.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Nada.
That was that was a wonderful bongo sound you were getting. Were you just playing with the tips of your fingers at one point?
Yeah, normally I use just 2 fingers, unless I need to be louder, in which case I use, 2 or my whole hand.
Oh, marvellous having you both with us this evening.
Thank you.
And you're playing about town, or around Wellington at least, shortly, are you?
That's right, we are, yes. We're playing on the 20th of January at the Kelburn pub, the Kelburn Village pub, with a great singer from Cuba called Roberto Rodriguez, and we're called Cuba Blue.
Not the film director.
No, not the film director, not as far as we know.
Marvellous. Well, thanks very much for coming in. And next week, unfortunately, is going to be on the environment.
That's right, Emma. Yes, we'll bring it back to the environment, which is the human relation with the environment, which is what geography is all about, and try and wrap it up with a couple of nice sing-songs and get you dancing.
Great. Thanks, Warwick.